And now, marine weather around Alaska.
All right, looking at today's sea ice analysis again, you can see the change from yesterday is a good portion of the Chukchi Sea that was sea ice free now has at least some light amounts of ice across the whole area there. Bering Strait still open up in toward the southeastern Chukchi Sea here. And of course, this could close off at any time. And for the tonight's forecast, strong low moving up to southwest Shelikof Strait here. And winds slowly diminish here for eastern king salmon, but winter storm warning continues out for the Bristol Bay area with winter weather advisories, southern Kuskokwim Valley, snow and blowing snow through these areas again, actually extending down to the Alaska Peninsula. Lighter winds, but still a lot of snow showers there for the eastern Aleutians, all the way up into the Bering Strait and Chukchi Sea. Winter storm warning out, Copper River Basin, western Prince William Sound area, and into the Matanuska Valley for heavy snow and blowing snow, mainly blowing snow for the Matanuska Valley with winds possibly gusting over 60 miles an hour. Big increase in the winds here for the at least the eastern North Gulf Coast in advance of this front here as southeast winds increase across the Copper River Basin. That's going to kind of cut the snow off in some areas there and enhance it in the upslope areas, but increasing snow up into the interior, increasing rain and wind for the north coast of the Panhandle. Tomorrow, low pressure starts to weaken a little bit here. See the gradients really spread out, so the winds becoming light here where they were pretty strong today. Still pretty breezy here from about Dillingham westward into the Kuskokwim Delta and actually all the way up into the eastern Bering Sea here. Increasing winds for the Brooks Range. And for the next day, Tuesday, big next storm comes up. The first one kind of just splits here, troughs out, weakens. Another trough through the eastern interior, keeping snow going there. Pretty gusty winds over interior Alaska, and see quite a few lines, tight gradient here from the Brooks Range southward. Even stronger gradient here. Storm force winds along the coast. High wind watches out for the inside water areas for winds gusting over 60 miles an hour to the south and southeast. For tomorrow, for the south coast of the Panhandle, south winds 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings up to the north central coast, south to southeast 35 to 40 knots. East-southeast 35 to 40 knots for the north coast. And southeast winds 25, gusts 35 knots for Clarence Strait. Southeast 35, gusts 40 knots for Stevens Passage. That's good for gale warnings. And southeast 25, gusts 40 knots for Lynn Canal. And then as that next strong frontal system approaches the coastline, storm warnings out for the south coast here, increasing, or southeast winds increasing to 50 knots. Seas building anywhere from 30 to 35 feet here. And north central coast here, east-southeast winds 45 knots. And east to southeast winds 50 knots for the north coast. Storm warnings out for Lynn Canal. Southeast winds 50 knots with higher gusts. Good gales for Clarence Strait, or actually Stevens Passage. I was looking at Clarence Strait, storm warning out there, southeast 50 knots, seas 22 feet. Stevens Passage, southeast 40 to 50 knot winds. And for Prince William Sound tomorrow, gale warning, south winds 35 knots, seas 9 feet, North Gulf or eastern North Gulf Coast. Gale warning, south winds 35 to 40 knots, 30 knots to the western North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands. Gale warning, south at 35. Kamishak Bay, southern Cook Inlet, south winds 30 knots and southeast 25 knots for northern Cook Inlet. And then for Tuesday, north winds 15 knots, northern Cook Inlet, small craft advisory, southern Cook Inlet north at 25, west-northwest at 30 knots for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. And then full gales here coming into the eastern North Gulf Coast up to 45 knots. And Prince William Sound, southeast winds 30 knots, seas 7 feet. Kodiak Island for Monday, southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 30 to 40 knots. And Bristol Bay, northwest at 20, seas 6 feet. And for Tuesday, Bristol Bay, still the lightest winds there will occur there. North at 20, seas 7 feet. Northwest winds 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. West-northwest 25 knots for Kodiak Island. Excuse me. Northwest winds 30 knots. Excuse me again, a lot of dust in here. And bright lights. Anyway, northwest 30 knots for Monday for the eastern Aleutians. Northwest 25 for Adak and Atka. And for the western Aleutians, actually that next front should kick the winds up to 30 knots here from Kiska to Shemya on Monday, but then it weakens, but still some gales out of the northwest from Chitka Island there. North 20 knots for Adak and Atka. Northwest winds 30 to 35 knots for the eastern Aleutians. Southwest coast tomorrow, north winds 30 to 40 knots. Gale warnings for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, north at 35 knots. North 35, St. Matthew Island, Pribilofs north at 30 knots. And for Tuesday, St. Lawrence Island, full gales at 40 knots out of the north. Gale warnings for the southwest coast. North winds 35 knots, northwest 35 for the Pribilofs. North at 40 for St. Matthew Island. Norton Sound, north winds 30 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east-northeasterlies 15 to 20 knots. North winds at 10 knots for the central coast, north 15 western coast, and 30 to 40 knot northerlies there for the Chukchi Sea. And for Tuesday, 25 to 35 knot winds from the north and northeast here for the Chukchi Sea. Western Arctic coast, north at 15. North winds 20 knots for the central coast, and eastern Beaufort Sea coast looking at northeast winds at 20 knots.